"Ma'am, take one more step, and I'll have you removed from this aircraft." The words sliced through the polished cabin with the confidence of someone who believed authority could never be questioned. Every conversation stopped. Crystal glasses rested untouched on walnut tables. The quiet hum of the engines suddenly felt louder than the people inside the luxurious Gulfstream G700 waiting for departure from Teterboro Airport just outside New York City. The flight attendant stood in the center aisle, her posture rigid, her expression certain. Emily Carter had only worked for Brooks Executive Aviation for 6 weeks, but she carried herself like she owned every inch of the cabin. Across from her stood a black woman wearing dark jeans, white sneakers, and a simple charcoal sweater beneath a light trench coat. No designer handbag, no jewelry worth noticing, no entourage, no visible reason, at least in Emily's mind, for her to be standing inside a private jet valued at more than $75 million. "You heard me," Emily said louder, making sure the passengers seated nearby could hear every word. "The owner hasn't arrived yet. Staff entrances are in the rear. You don't belong up here." A few heads slowly turned. A gray-haired businessman folded his newspaper. A young couple exchanged uncomfortable glances. Another passenger quietly looked away, unwilling to become involved. The woman at the center of the confrontation never raised her voice. She simply met Emily's eyes with remarkable calm. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be," she answered. Emily let out a short laugh that echoed through the otherwise silent cabin. "No, you're not." She stepped closer, invading the woman's personal space as if confidence alone could make her judgment correct. People can't just wander onto a private jet because they think nobody will notice. The woman remained still. Her breathing never changed. Her shoulders never tightened. She looked almost disappointed, as though she had watched this scene unfold too many times before. Emily mistook that silence for surrender. "I'm asking you one final time," she declared. "Leave before airport security gets involved." Then, in one impulsive motion, driven by frustration rather than professionalism, Emily reached out in an attempt to forcefully hurry the woman back toward the cabin entrance. The sudden contact drew a collective gasp. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Even Emily seemed surprised by how quickly the atmosphere changed. Time itself appeared to hesitate. The woman slowly turned her head back toward Emily. There was no anger in her face. No panic. Only an unsettling composure that somehow made the entire cabin feel smaller. Near the galley, a junior flight attendant named Sophie Bennett felt her stomach tighten. She recognized something about the woman's face, but couldn't place it. During orientation, she had seen dozens of executive photographs displayed on presentation slides. One image drifted into her memory, blurred but persistent. Before she could speak, Emily folded her arms and looked around the cabin as though expecting applause for protecting company property. Instead, she found uncertainty. The businessman lowered his newspaper completely. The young couple exchanged another glance. Someone quietly reached for a phone, but stopped before pressing record. The woman finally spoke again, her voice measured enough that everyone leaned forward to hear it. "You still have time to rethink what happens next." Emily smiled without the slightest hint of concern. "The only thing happening next is you leaving this airplane." The woman nodded once, almost sympathetically, then glanced toward the cockpit door before returning her eyes to Emily. "No one aboard that aircraft. Not the passengers, not the pilots behind the closed cockpit door, and certainly not the flight attendant standing so confidently in the aisle. Realized they had just humiliated the founder, chief executive officer, and sole owner of the aircraft beneath their feet. 7 minutes earlier, the cabin had been quiet enough to hear the faint clicking of crystal against polished wood as the catering crew completed their final preparations. Naomi Brooks preferred arriving before everyone else whenever she flew. It was never about convenience. It was about observation. Years earlier, after her company acquired its first executive aircraft, she had promised herself she would never become the kind of leader who only experienced luxury through filtered reports and carefully staged presentations. Every few months, she boarded one of her own aircraft without notifying the crew beyond the legally required passenger manifest. She dressed the same way she always did on inspection days. Comfortable jeans, clean sneakers, a plain sweater, no jewelry that announced wealth, no assistant walking 3 steps behind her, no security detail clearing a path. She wanted people to react to a person instead of a title. Most days, those quiet visits reminded her why she loved her company. Pilots greeted passengers with respect. Flight attendants treated every guest with professionalism. Small acts of kindness often revealed more about a culture than any executive meeting ever could. That morning had begun with the same expectation. Naomi had parked her own SUV at the private terminal, thanked the ground staff by name, and carried a single leather backpack over her shoulder. The line technician fueling the aircraft smiled politely and wished her a safe trip without recognizing her. She appreciated that. Genuine courtesy was always more valuable than forced admiration. Inside the fixed base operator lounge, she noticed framed photographs celebrating Brooks' executive aviation, receiving customer satisfaction awards for 5 consecutive years. She remembered standing on that stage accepting the first award almost a decade earlier. The applause had never mattered as much as the promise behind it. Every passenger deserved dignity before status, respect before assumptions. Those words had become part of every employee handbook. She had personally approved them. As she stepped onto the aircraft, the familiar scent of fresh coffee and polished leather reminded her how much the company had grown. 20 years earlier, she had been a young aerospace engineer whose ideas were dismissed in conference rooms where she was often the only black woman present. More than once, she had mistaken silence for acceptance until she realized silence sometimes concealed prejudice waiting for an opportunity to speak. One memory returned with surprising clarity. She was 27 years old, carrying blueprints through a regional airport after winning her first aviation contract. A man in an expensive suit had stopped her and asked if she was part of the cleaning crew because, in his words, executives did not look like her. She never forgot how ordinary that sentence sounded to everyone except the person hearing it. Instead of allowing bitterness to define her, she built a company where appearance would never outweigh character. That mission had attracted talented people from across the country. It had also convinced investors that integrity could become a competitive advantage. Today, Brooks Executive Aviation operated a fleet serving Fortune 500 executives, medical relief organizations, and government agencies across the United States. Yet none of those achievements mattered if even one employee ignored the values that built the company. Naomi had not boarded the aircraft expecting perfection. She had boarded expecting honesty. The difference mattered. A flawless organization did not exist. An accountable one could. As the cabin door closed behind her, and she quietly greeted the nearest crew member with a warm smile, she believed she was about to witness another routine inspection. Instead, within moments, she found herself standing in the aisle listening to an employee explain why someone who looked like her could not possibly belong aboard the very aircraft that carried her name on every registration document filed with the Federal Aviation Administration. Emily Carter folded her arms with growing confidence because no one had challenged her authority. In her mind, the silence around the cabin confirmed that she had made the correct decision. She glanced toward the forward galley where another attendant was organizing refreshments. "Sophie," she called without taking her eyes off Naomi. "Contact Captain Daniel Reynolds and let him know we have an unauthorized person refusing instructions." Sophie Bennett hesitated. Her fingers froze above the service cart. Something about the passenger standing calmly in the aisle continued to bother her. During orientation only a month earlier, she had watched a corporate training video introducing the leadership team of Brooks Executive Aviation. The woman before her looked familiar, but the casual clothing refused to match the polished executive portrait she vaguely remembered. Before Sophie could answer, Emily repeated herself with sharper emphasis. "Did you hear me?" Sophie quietly nodded and disappeared toward the cockpit, although uncertainty followed every step. Across the cabin, a white businessman named Richard Collins adjusted his tailored jacket and looked directly at Naomi with open skepticism. "Private aviation has strict security for a reason," he remarked loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear. "People cannot simply wander aboard and expect special treatment." Naomi turned toward him with the same composed expression she had maintained since boarding. "I agree," she answered. "Security should always be based on facts." Richard gave a dismissive smile. "Then showing identification should not be a problem." Naomi reached into her backpack without hesitation and removed a slim leather card holder. Before she could open it, Emily stepped forward and raised her hand. "That will not be necessary," she interrupted. "Anyone can print a fake identification card these days." Several passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The confidence in Emily's voice sounded less like policy and more like assumption. Naomi slowly lowered the card holder. "You have already decided who I am," she said evenly. "You are no longer interested in evidence." Emily ignored the observation completely. She pressed the cabin intercom. "Ground operations, please keep the aircraft door open. We may require airport security before departure." The words spread through the cabin like cold air. A woman seated near the rear windows looked away with visible discomfort. Another passenger quietly whispered, "This seems unnecessary." Richard shook his head. "Rules exist for everyone," he replied, as though reassuring himself more than anyone else. Moments later, Captain Daniel Reynolds emerged from the cockpit wearing his Navy uniform with 4 silver stripes across each shoulder. He had flown corporate aircraft for more than 20 years and was respected throughout the company for his professionalism. Emily immediately stepped beside him. "Captain, this woman entered the aircraft claiming she belongs here, but she refuses to cooperate." Daniel studied Naomi carefully. She stood relaxed with both hands visible, making no effort to argue or leave. There was something unusual about the calm in her eyes. It was not the confidence of someone trying to bluff. It was the patience of someone waiting for another person to reveal who they truly were. "Ma'am," Daniel began politely, "may I ask your name?" Before Naomi could answer, Emily spoke over her. She already had plenty of opportunities to explain herself. Daniel frowned almost imperceptibly. He preferred hearing directly from people instead of through someone else's version of events. Yet the pressure of a scheduled departure in a cabin full of watching passengers weighed heavily on every decision. Near the galley, Sophie returned carrying the passenger manifest. She glanced down at the printed list, then back toward Naomi. Her heartbeat quickened. One name near the top had suddenly captured her full attention, and for the first time since the confrontation began, she realized this situation might not be unfolding the way anyone believed. Sophie's eyes moved across the passenger manifest one line at a time. The names of the scheduled guests appeared exactly where she expected them until she reached the final entry. She blinked once, then again, convinced she had misread it. Printed in bold letters beside the aircraft registration was a name she had seen during orientation, leadership meetings streamed to new employees, and every annual corporate ethics presentation. Naomi Brooks. Owner authorization. Executive priority. Sophie's pulse quickened. She lifted her eyes toward the woman standing quietly in the aisle, then back to the manifest. The resemblance she had been struggling to place suddenly became unmistakable. The hairstyle was different. The clothing was ordinary. But the calm expression was exactly the same as the photograph displayed inside company headquarters beneath a quote that every new employee was expected to remember. "Respect is demonstrated long before titles are revealed." Sophie took a careful step toward Captain Daniel Reynolds. She lowered her voice so only he could hear. "Captain, I think there may be a mistake." Daniel accepted the manifest and glanced down without changing his expression. Before his eyes reached the final line, Emily stepped between them. "There is no mistake," she insisted. "She is delaying departure, and every minute costs money." Daniel remained silent as he continued reading. Emily mistook his silence for agreement. Richard Collins leaned comfortably into his seat with growing confidence. "This is exactly why private aviation needs standards," he remarked. "You cannot allow anyone to walk aboard simply because they appear confident." Naomi slowly turned toward him. "Confidence is easy to imitate," she replied calmly. "Character is much harder." Richard laughed softly. "Character does not put someone on a passenger list." Daniel's eyes finally stopped at the last entry. His forehead tightened almost imperceptibly. He looked up at Naomi, then back to the manifest again as though searching for an explanation that would fit everything happening inside the cabin. Sophie spoke carefully. "Captain, that authorization code can only be assigned by corporate executive operations." Emily immediately shook her head. Someone probably entered it incorrectly. Sophie looked directly at her supervisor for the first time since joining the company. "The system does not allow manual changes to executive authorization." Emily folded her arms. "Then the system is wrong." Those words seemed to hang in the cabin longer than anyone expected. Daniel slowly closed the manifest without responding. He had spent decades trusting procedures because procedures prevented dangerous assumptions. Yet assumptions were beginning to overpower procedure right in front of him. Naomi watched the exchange without interruption. She neither defended herself nor demanded an apology. The longer she remained silent, the more uncomfortable the atmosphere became. Near the rear of the cabin, an older woman quietly set aside the business magazine she had been reading. Perhaps everyone should slow down, she suggested gently. Nobody here appears to be causing any harm. Emily forced a polite smile that failed to hide her irritation. Ma'am, we appreciate your concern, but this is a security matter. The passenger answered without raising her voice. Security should include verifying facts before reaching conclusions. Several heads nodded almost instinctively. Richard noticed the shift in mood and quickly added, rules cannot bend because someone feels offended. Naomi met his eyes. Neither should they change because someone looks different from what you expected. No one answered. Daniel looked once more at the closed manifest in his hand. Years of experience whispered that something was deeply wrong, not with the passenger standing before him, but with the decisions unfolding around her. Before he could speak, the aircraft communication panel chimed with a secure incoming call from Brooks Executive Aviation Headquarters. The display identified it as Executive Operations, a line that almost never rang without urgent reason, and every eye in the cockpit doorway instinctively turned toward the illuminated screen. The soft chime from the communication panel echoed through the cabin with surprising weight, but before Captain Daniel Reynolds could reach for it, Emily stepped forward. We can deal with that after this passenger leaves, she insisted, her confidence now sounding forced instead of certain. Daniel looked from the flashing panel to Naomi, then back to Emily. Years of experience had taught him that urgency rarely arrived by coincidence. Still, the tension inside the cabin had grown so quickly that every decision now carried unusual consequences. Naomi remained exactly where she stood, her backpack resting beside one of the leather seats. She did not argue. She did not demand to answer the call. She simply watched. That composure unsettled Emily far more than anger ever could. You are refusing crew instructions, Emily declared. If necessary, we will delay this flight until airport security arrives. The words drifted across the cabin, but they no longer carried the certainty they had only moments earlier. Sophie Bennett quietly looked toward the illuminated communication panel again. Executive Operations was still calling. That line almost never disconnected without someone answering. She swallowed hard. Every second that passed made her growing suspicion harder to ignore. Naomi noticed Sophie's expression and offered a small, reassuring nod. It was not permission. It was encouragement. Sophie suddenly remembered another sentence from orientation. The instructor had paused beneath a large photograph of the company's founder and told every new employee, when policy and assumptions disagree, verify before you judge. At the time, it had sounded like another corporate slogan. Standing inside the cabin now, it felt like a warning everyone else had forgotten. Naomi's thoughts drifted somewhere else entirely. She remembered walking through another aviation terminal almost 20 years earlier after closing her first major engineering contract. She had carried nothing more than a laptop bag and a folder of signed documents. A stranger had smiled politely before asking whether she was delivering equipment to the executives upstairs. She still remembered the awkward silence after explaining that she was the executive. Nobody apologized. They simply looked embarrassed and walked away. That moment had stayed with her, not because it ruined her day, but because it revealed how quickly people built stories about someone they had never met. She had promised herself that if success ever gave her influence, she would build organizations where curiosity came before judgment. Looking around the cabin now, she wondered how many people had memorized the company's policies without understanding its values. Richard Collins broke the silence. If this were my aircraft, I would expect the crew to remove anyone they could not identify. Naomi looked toward him with quiet patience. Would you expect them to verify who the owner was first? Richard hesitated for the first time. Before he could answer, the communication panel chimed again. Executive Operations. Priority Level 1. Daniel's attention immediately shifted toward the display. Sophie spoke carefully. Captain, Priority Level 1 calls are supposed to be answered immediately. Emily sighed in visible frustration. This is becoming ridiculous. Headquarters can wait. Daniel slowly turned toward her. No, they cannot. His voice remained calm, but something had changed. It was no longer the voice of someone following another person's judgment. It was the voice of a captain returning to procedure. Emily noticed the difference and folded her arms more tightly. She still believed she was protecting the company. She had not yet considered the possibility that she was protecting the wrong version of it. Daniel stepped toward the cockpit entrance, paused beside the flashing communication panel, and looked back one final time at Naomi Brooks. The quiet confidence in her face matched the name printed on the passenger manifest, the executive authorization code, and now the urgency coming directly from corporate headquarters. For the first time since the confrontation began, he found himself asking not who she was, but why everyone else had been so certain she could not possibly be exactly who she claimed to be. Captain Daniel Reynolds pressed the illuminated button, and the secure line connected almost instantly. He listened without speaking for several seconds. The color slowly drained from his face. "Yes," he answered quietly. "Understood." His eyes shifted toward Naomi before he continued. "No, nothing has departed yet." The call ended, but the silence that followed carried more weight than any announcement. Emily took one impatient step forward. "Captain, are we finished with this distraction?" Daniel did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward Sophie. "Please secure the cabin for a brief delay." Emily frowned. "A delay for what?" Daniel inhaled slowly. "For verification." Emily shook her head in disbelief. "Verification has already been done." Naomi finally spoke, her voice calm enough that everyone in the cabin could hear every word without effort. "No, assumptions have been made. Verification is only beginning." Daniel nodded almost imperceptibly. The sentence echoed what he had been thinking ever since reading the passenger manifest. Naomi reached into the pocket of her sweater and removed a small company-issued phone that had remained out of sight throughout the confrontation. She unlocked it, selected a single contact, and placed the call on speaker. The line connected before the second ring. "Good morning, Ms. Brooks." A professional voice answered immediately. "Sandra speaking." Naomi smiled faintly. "Good morning, Sandra. Please activate Executive Aviation Protocol 7 for aircraft November 7 Bravo Alpha." There was no urgency in her tone. No anger. No demand for revenge. Only the calm precision of someone initiating a routine procedure. Sandra replied without hesitation. "Protocol 7 confirmed. Executive operations, human resources, corporate security, and flight standards have been notified. Live compliance review has begun. Estimated completion time is 3 minutes." Naomi thanked her and ended the call. No one inside the cabin spoke. Richard Collins stared across the aisle, trying to reconcile the ordinary woman he believed he had understood with the effortless authority he had just witnessed. Sophie lowered her eyes, realizing the name she had read on the manifest had never been a mistake. Emily forced a nervous laugh. "Anyone can make a phone call." Naomi looked toward her. "That is true." She slipped the phone back into her pocket. "The difference is whether the organization responds." Almost as soon as she finished speaking, the cabin lighting dimmed for a brief systems reset before returning to normal. Daniel's tablet mounted beside the cockpit door displayed an incoming series of encrypted notifications. Executive operations, flight standards, corporate compliance, human resources. Each message carried the same priority level. Daniel opened the first one. His shoulders stiffened. The aircraft had officially been placed into an executive review status, a designation he had seen only once in his career. It instructed the crew to suspend all discretionary actions until corporate leadership completed an immediate investigation. Emily stepped closer, confusion replacing confidence. "Why is flight standards involved?" Daniel looked at her with measured seriousness. "Because Protocol 7 can only be authorized by one person." Emily waited for him to continue, but he remained silent. The answer was already standing 10 feet away. Around the cabin, passengers who had quietly watched the confrontation began exchanging uncertain glances. The older woman near the rear folded her hands and offered Naomi a gentle smile of understanding. Richard slowly looked down at the floor, replaying every assumption he had voiced only minutes earlier. Sophie felt equal parts relief and regret. Relief that the truth was finally emerging. Regret that she had not trusted her instincts sooner. Naomi remained composed, her attention fixed not on the notifications appearing across company systems, but on the people inside the cabin. She knew policies could correct procedures, but only people could correct prejudice. Outside the aircraft windows, the morning sunlight reflected across the polished fuselage while, inside, the balance of authority quietly shifted away from appearances and back toward the truth. Captain Daniel Reynolds lowered the tablet slowly, as though moving too quickly might somehow change what was written across the screen. Every notification confirmed the same fact. Executive Protocol 7 had been activated directly by the founder and chief executive officer of Brooks Executive Aviation. There was no room for interpretation. There was no possibility of administrative error. Daniel stepped away from the cockpit doorway and faced Naomi with visible respect. "Ms. Brooks," he said calmly, "I owe you an apology. I should have verified the facts before allowing this situation to continue." Naomi gave a slight nod. "Thank you, Captain." Accountability always begins with the person willing to say those words. Emily stared at both of them, unable to reconcile the conversation unfolding before her. "This cannot be right," she whispered. She never identified herself. Naomi looked toward her without resentment. "You never asked who I was. You decided who I could not be." The sentence settled heavily across the cabin. Richard Collins shifted uncomfortably in his seat, remembering every confident remark he had made only minutes earlier. For the first time since boarding, he avoided looking directly at Naomi. Sophie quietly handed Daniel another secure message that had just appeared on the tablet. He read it before addressing the cabin. "Executive Operations has confirmed Ms. Brooks as the owner of this aircraft and the founder of this company." Several passengers released quiet breaths they had not realized they were holding. The older woman near the rear simply closed her eyes for a moment, as though the confirmation saddened her more than it surprised her. Emily's face lost every trace of certainty. I thought." She began before the words disappeared. Naomi answered gently. "Yes, you thought. That is exactly where this began." She picked up her backpack and placed it neatly beside her assigned seat before turning back toward the crew. "Do you know why I travel like this from time to time?" Nobody answered. "Because annual reports cannot measure respect. Customer surveys cannot reveal hidden assumptions. Policies printed inside employee handbooks do not tell me how people behave when they believe nobody important is watching." Her voice never rose, yet every passenger listened with complete attention. Leadership is not tested when everyone recognizes the chief executive officer. Leadership is tested when an ordinary person walks through the door. Daniel lowered his eyes briefly. Sophie felt tears forming but remained composed. Even Richard seemed unable to defend the opinions he had expressed with such confidence earlier. Naomi continued, "I have spent decades building a company where dignity is supposed to come before appearance. Not because it creates better publicity, because it creates better people." Emily swallowed hard. "I never meant to disrespect you." Naomi answered immediately, "I believe you." Emily looked up in surprise. Naomi continued before she could respond. "Intent matters, but impact matters too. A person can sincerely believe they are protecting standards while quietly abandoning the values those standards were created to defend." The cabin remained silent except for the faint sound of conditioned air flowing through the vents. Daniel finally spoke again. "Executive Operations is requesting instructions regarding today's flight." Naomi looked around. The cabin, meeting the eyes of every passenger one by one. No one looked away this time. "The flight will continue," she said. "The people traveling today should not be punished for what happened." She paused for a brief moment before adding, "But neither should we pretend that nothing happened." Another secure notification appeared on Daniel's tablet. Executive Human Resources had arrived inside the terminal and requested permission to board immediately. Emily saw the message reflected in the screen and slowly understood that the conversation had moved beyond embarrassment. What had begun as a series of unchecked assumptions was now becoming a defining moment that would shape not only her future, but the culture of the company itself. Within 2 minutes, the cabin door opened once again. 3 members of the Executive Human Resources and Corporate Compliance team stepped aboard wearing Navy business attire and company identification badges. They were not rushed, yet every movement reflected careful preparation. Leading the group was Angela Morris, the Executive Vice President of Human Resources, a woman who had worked alongside Naomi Brooks for nearly 15 years. The moment Angela entered the cabin, she looked directly at Naomi and offered a respectful nod. "Good morning, Ms. Brooks." The greeting settled every remaining doubt inside the aircraft. There was no hesitation, no confusion, no uncertainty. Emily lowered her eyes toward the floor. Richard Collins slowly removed his glasses, suddenly fascinated by the newspaper folded across his lap. Angela turned toward Captain Daniel Reynolds. "Captain, thank you for preserving the scene exactly as requested under Executive Protocol 7. Daniel acknowledged her quietly. "I regret that verification came later than it should have." Angela answered with professional calm. "That is one of the reasons this protocol exists." She then faced Emily. "Ms. Carter, effective immediately, you are being placed on paid administrative leave while corporate compliance conducts a formal review of today's events. This action is procedural. You will have the opportunity to provide a complete statement." Emily looked up, her voice barely audible. "Am I being terminated?" Angela answered carefully. "No employment decision has been made today. Our responsibility is to determine what happened, why it happened, and whether company values were followed." Naomi remained silent throughout the exchange. She had no interest in humiliating anyone. Accountability, in her view, was never meant to become public entertainment. Angela continued speaking to the entire cabin rather than to one individual. Brooks Executive Aviation was founded on the principle that every person deserves equal dignity regardless of appearance, background, or assumptions made about them. Today's review concerns whether those standards were upheld. Several passengers nodded quietly. The older woman near the rear smiled with quiet appreciation, while Sophie felt both relieved and humbled listening to the words that had first inspired her to join the company. Richard slowly raised his hand. "I would like to provide a statement as well." Every eye turned toward him. He cleared his throat before continuing. "Some of the assumptions made today did not come only from the crew. I contributed to them." His voice lacked the certainty it had carried earlier. "I judged someone I had never met. I would like that included in the record." Naomi looked toward him and simply nodded. Owning a mistake required a different kind of courage than avoiding one. Angela thanked him before documenting his request. Emily remained motionless. She replayed every decision she had made since Naomi boarded the aircraft. At no point had she verified a name, checked executive authorization, or asked a genuine question. She had relied entirely on what she believed someone like the owner should look like. That realization hurt more than any disciplinary process waiting ahead. Naomi finally stood and addressed everyone in the cabin. This company was never built to prove that successful people deserve respect. It was built to prove that every person deserves respect before success is ever measured. No one interrupted. If someone must reveal wealth, authority, or a title before receiving basic dignity, then we have already failed. The cabin remained completely still. Even the quiet sounds of preparation outside the aircraft seemed distant. Angela closed her folder and confirmed that all preliminary documentation had been completed. Procedures would continue after landing. Training records, witness statements, and company policies would all be reviewed. But everyone aboard understood that the most important lesson had already been delivered. It had not come from a policy manual or a disciplinary meeting. It had come from the calm example of a leader who never needed to raise her voice to reveal where true authority had belonged all along. The executive human resources team quietly departed the aircraft after completing the initial review, and the cabin door closed once more. For the first time that morning, genuine silence settled over everyone on board. It was no longer the silence of confusion. It was the silence that follows an uncomfortable truth. Captain Daniel Reynolds returned to the cockpit to prepare for departure, while Sophie Bennett completed the final cabin checks with a renewed sense of purpose. Every greeting she offered each passenger sounded more thoughtful than before, as though she now understood that professionalism was measured not by polished routines, but by consistent respect. Richard Collins remained seated near the window, staring at the runway stretching into the distance. Just before the aircraft began to taxi, he stood and slowly walked toward Naomi. Several passengers watched quietly, uncertain what he intended to say. Richard stopped beside her seat. "Ms. Brooks," he began, "I spent my career believing I judged people by experience and qualifications. Today I learned that I often judged them long before either of those things had a chance to speak. I cannot change what I said earlier, but I can admit that I was wrong." Naomi looked up at him with the same calm expression she had carried since stepping aboard. "Learning begins the moment certainty ends," she replied. Do not waste today by pretending it never happened. Richard nodded once before returning to his seat, carrying with him a lesson no business seminar could have delivered. A few moments later, Captain Reynolds' voice came across the cabin speakers. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We are now cleared for departure. The aircraft slowly rolled away from the terminal, and sunlight reflected across the wings as the engines quietly increased power. Naomi watched the familiar view through the window, remembering the countless obstacles that had filled the years before this morning. Investors who questioned whether she could lead. Clients who assumed she was an assistant instead of the founder. Meetings where people searched the room for the chief executive officer without realizing she had been speaking for the last 10 minutes. None of those moments had convinced her to stop building. Instead, they reminded her why she had started in the first place. Success had never been about proving strangers wrong. It had always been about creating opportunities where future generations would have to prove less and be respected more. After the aircraft reached cruising altitude, Naomi opened her laptop and began drafting a company-wide message. She announced expanded leadership training focused on unconscious bias, respectful communication, and accountability at every level of the organization. She also introduced a new practice requiring executives, including herself, to continue conducting unannounced operational visits throughout the company. Culture, she wrote, could never be protected from behind a conference room door. It had to be experienced where real decisions happened every day. Weeks later, the review concluded with actions based on verified facts, company policy, and individual accountability. Brooks Executive Aviation strengthened its training programs and reaffirmed the values that had built the company from the beginning. Employees across the organization spoke openly about the incident, not as a story of public embarrassment, but as a reminder that integrity is measured by how quickly people are willing to confront their own assumptions. Long after that flight landed, passengers remembered something far more valuable than a luxurious aircraft or an executive title. They remembered a woman who never needed to announce her position to demonstrate her character. They remembered that dignity should never depend on appearance, wealth, or recognition. And they remembered that true leadership does not reveal its strength through anger or revenge. It reveals its strength through patience, fairness, and the quiet confidence to let the truth arrive in its own time.